going to look at the first type of market failure, which is known as the externalities that occur in a market. But before you do that, you really do need to understand what it is that you've been looking at up to date when you've been talking about the whole idea of demand and supply curves, and the fact that the supply curve, for example, reflects the private cost. That's the private costs to the firm of producing the goods in the marketplace. So they take into account land and labour and raw materials, etc. And the demand curve is drawn on the basis that it reflects the private benefits. That's the benefits to the individuals in the market. And it's their private benefits. They don't worry about benefits that are received or costs on other people. It's just they look into the private benefit for them. So when we get to externalities, we need to consider this fact that the one party that makes its private decisions, let's say it's firms, or it could be, as I say, individuals, there will also be a third-party effect. That's known as the external effect, the third-party effect. And it'll either be a benefit from consumption or production, or it'll be a cost. So you can have a benefit and a cost on consumption and on production. So in reality, there are 4 different diagrams that we could look at, but in the Edexcel example, they only look for 2 diagrams. I'll give you an example of this. So let's say a firm produces, and in producing, it pollutes the atmosphere. So what you're saying then is that it takes into account its own private costs of raw materials and labour, etc., but it ignores all the pollution that it causes on the third party. Those are the external costs, okay, of production, and that's what we're going to look at in this video. You can also have smoking. That's the idea that if you and I smoke, we get a benefit, but we ignore the third-party effects of our smoking on, as I say, on the other people around us. For example, if we decide to take a shower, I look at the benefits to me, but you would also have a benefit if you were spending time with me, because I'd start to smell nice, okay? And it's those sorts of things that we would basically be looking at in these videos. So the first one, this one, we're going to look at the external costs of production. So we put on here benefits and costs, so that's something to consider. And we recognize that the supply curve for the firm, they only take into account their private costs, whereas there is an ever-increasing external cost. So that might be pollution, it might be congestion, etc. And those costs are on the third party, but they're ignored by the firm when they're making their decisions. So therefore, we need to think, well, what is the cost to the whole society? And the key about society, or social costs and benefits, are that it includes the first party and the third party, i.e. the private and the external. Okay, so there might be a private cost here, for example, and there might be a couple of external costs, maybe pollution, maybe congestion that goes on because of the firm's decision to produce and take into account all its private costs. It ignores those. But for society, okay, you'll see that this is society, where you have your first party and your third party, the private costs and the external costs, and therefore the social cost includes the first and the third, the private and the external. So if, for example, we saw that at these different levels of output here, there's an external cost, that's the cost of pollution, for example, then what we should do to get the social costs is add those external costs onto the private costs. So the private costs are here, we need to add that value there for the external costs, and the same for each of these levels of output. So that would give us here what we call our marginal social cost curve, which is the private costs plus the external costs. Okay, so that's what you've got to be thinking about when you draw your production on the production side and the negative externality. So it's a addition to your cost, it's a negative thing, it's adding to the private costs of production. Okay, so when we then look at that in terms of the market, what we do is we draw in our private costs, we draw in our demand curve, and because you only look at an externality on one side of the market, don't try it on two sides, you can do it, but it's a bit more tricky. You've got to say that on the demand side, you've got the private and the social benefits are the same. In other words, there's no external benefit or cost on the demand side of the market, on the consumption side. It's all happening on the production side. Okay, so this would give you your market outcome here, where the private costs and the private benefits are equal. So the market always produces where the privates are equal. Then you bring in the externality and the fact that you've got a social cost. So here's your social cost. The same curve here is the social benefit. So therefore, we say that the optimum quantity is found where the social benefit and the social costs are equal. And that is the optimum point. You can call it Q star, Q socially optimum, whatever you want to call it. Okay. Then what you'll see is that the market has overproduced, and that's the first thing that you really need to do in your analysis, is find that a market has either under or over. And in this case, and it always is with a bad thing, the market will always overproduce a bad thing. This is an extra cost that hasn't been taken into account. So I've just drawn the demand curve in a slightly different way. So you've got your black one, which is the private benefit, and the red one, same curve, which is the social benefit. No externalities on consumption. You've got your optimum point, that's the optimum in the market. There's your market. So this is where we are actually producing. This is where, if you like, we should. And I always try and stress that we should is the socially optimum, social cost, social benefit is our should produce point. Okay, so the first thing we say is that the market has overproduced, okay, because it's producing here, and really in terms of society it should have stopped here. And the reasoning is that for society's welfare, we need to consider the benefits and the costs, just as you do with welfare in normal markets. Okay, you look at what is the benefit and what is the cost, and if the benefit of any decision outweighs the costs, then you should have produced it, because there's an increase in the welfare in the economy. Benefits exceeding costs is an idea of welfare, well-being, and you should produce it. So up to this point here, the social benefit, here it is running down here, is in excess of social costs. So we would give that a tick. We should be producing that level of output, any of these levels of output here. But the question that you need to consider in your analysis is, should the market produce beyond Q opt? And so you take the social cost here it is, that's the social cost of producing, that's the marginal social cost. The extra social cost, that's the extra social benefit, but the cost has exceeded the benefit. So therefore your social welfare has started to go down. That's a negative social welfare for this particular one here, just for that extra one, remember. So your social welfare rises here when the social benefit exceeds the social cost. Each time it rises, but now it starts to go down. And so the answer is no, we should not have produced it if we wanted to maximize our social welfare. Then you go on each of those points and answer the question, no, we should not have produced that because the social cost exceeds the social benefit. So the social welfare loss is occurring here between this point and this point where we are actually producing, because the social cost exceeds the social benefit. Okay, and therefore what you have is what we call a welfare loss triangle. It's a social welfare loss triangle, because if we'd stopped here, we would have had a lot more social welfare. Now we're reducing by this amount here each time the amount of social welfare in the economy. So that's the diagram that you need to explain and analyze in your in any sort of essay work. Okay, and then after that you look for policies that can solve this problem. Okay.